Hi, everyone. So I wanted to go ahead and make some slides going over some strategies that you can use for making your argument in this paper. Um, okay, so first of all, I think that you want to be thinking about the thesis statement. And since this is going to be such a controversial topic, I mean, a lot of people do believe in conspiracy theories, right? And if the goal of rhetoric is to change people's minds, then hopefully we're reaching some people who do believe in these conspiracy theories, right? Keeping that in mind, then you might want to start your thesis statement with a concession. And so this is just a very effective technique for persuading people to consider listening to you. What you're basically doing is you're starting with the middle ground, or you're starting with an acknowledgement of some validity of the other side's argument. Okay. And so it's just really important to make sure that you include something like that here, because again, plenty of people do believe in conspiracy theories. So you're not going to just be preaching to the choir here and saying, like, of course, nobody really believes in this stuff. People do, right? And sometimes people have good reason for believing in conspiracy theories. For example, there is a history of, unethical human testing, right? And so when people are skeptical about certain medical practices or, government overseeing certain, experimentation or whatever, yeah, I mean, it's possible. There is a history of some of that type of behavior. So you want to make sure that you are starting with a position of respect and acknowledgement of potentially some validity or some, understandable reasoning of the other side before mentioning why they're wrong. Okay. And so you do want to make sure that you're decisive in your thesis statement. Um, you don't have to say it's impossible. That's extremely difficult to prove, as we talked about last time with burden of proof. But you should say, yeah, it's possible that, aliens have landed on Earth, of course, but it doesn't seem like there's really any evidence to support that Roswell is actually an alien testing facility. Of course, there is evidence. There's no credible, solid evidence. Okay, so let's look at the real case. And then you'll go into the rest of the paper where you're showing the evidence that you have found and really trying to combat some of the, not just misinformation, but even like kind of bad logic. So one of the important things to be thinking about with research papers is that we don't want to just be using sources for agreeing with them. We don't want to just find sources that we agree with and then just say, see, they said the same thing. You want to be engaging with sources in a more sophisticated way. And so I have some suggestions for that. And I also want to make sure that you're thinking about when to quote. A lot of people quote too much. Early writers quote too much. You want to kind of wean yourself off quoting too much. Sorry to be gross, but you want to get more in the habit of paraphrasing, taking ideas from writers rather than just completely quoting everything that they say. You want your quotes to be smaller, shorter, and really do more of the work for the reader. What happens when we have really long quotes is that we're basically asking the reader to do the work for us of kind of figuring out how it relates back to our argument. And so we want to start doing that work for the reader as much as we can. It's just something to be thinking about. So when should you quote? Anytime something is particularly well said or well written, that's a great time to quote, okay? If you need to boost your credibility, that's a good time to quote. If you have a good quote from somebody who people trust, that's a great time to quote, especially if it's something that you think might not be believed by everyone, right? Okay, 3, if it's just too difficult to paraphrase, some of the conspiracy theories that you might be talking about might involve, people or places, history that you're less familiar with, difficult scientific practices and things like that. And you might just have a hard time putting it in your own words. So I would just recommend, in those kinds of situations, quote that. And then anytime that you're talking about things on a sentence level, so for example, if you have a conspiracy theory about something that someone says, like, in the JFK assassination, it looks like he's saying something on camera. At that point, you might want to start, analyzing at a sentence level because you're really talking about what the words were that were spoken in order to analyze the truth of the argument. For the most part, you won't need that with this paper, but it's possible. Okay. So I have some tips here for paraphrasing, but the main tip that I have for paraphrasing is that, and paraphrasing just means that you're putting the author's idea in your own words. You don't want to be thinking about it on a sentence level, putting their words in your own words. Nope, that's very difficult to do. And so what I would recommend doing is reading an entire text or a paragraph, however you can kind of get a chunk of text instead of one sentence is going to help you to get the idea from that. And then when you put that, you can put that in your own words more easily. Okay. So if you're staring at a sentence and trying to figure out how do I say this in my own words, it's going to be extremely easy to copy too much of it. And then we have what's called patchwork plagiarism. And, it'll be something I point out in this class, and in future classes, it could be something that, could get you in trouble. So just be careful. um, Move my face here. So I have some suggestions about how to engage with sources that can be a little bit more interesting, a little more sophisticated, and honestly more helpful when you're engaging with sources that you don't necessarily agree with, which hopefully you will be for this paper, right? Because you're going to be looking at two different sides of an issue. So the first one is skeptic. I disagree. You're probably going to be using this type of structure when you're talking about the conspiracy theory sources, right? Because you're proving that they are, unlikely. So this skeptic here, the sources claim that blank is problematic because, okay, so basically what you're doing is you're saying, here's what the source's claim is, and there's a problem with this claim, and here's what it is. Okay, so that's the skeptic. Two is the contributor. This means you disagree, but you're also, or I mean, not you disagree, you agree with what the source is saying, and you're going to add something. So for example, if you're taking something that's historical, like a historical conspiracy theory, you might have a source that's a bit older. And then when you're looking at it today, you might be able to even add more information, right? So you have a source that says, in 2019, there was a survey about how many people believe that aliens are at Roswell. And then you could add something like, and that number has possibly increased today since, kind of the popularity of that location on the internet with memes and kind of movements to go there, right? Okay, and then the final one is the analyst. This is where you say, I agree with some of the argument, but not all of it. This is a really good strategy to use to kind of help pull people, to considering your side or to listening to you. And again, you're having a concession here. The source is correct about blank, right? They make a good point about blank. However, their main argument is wrong because, or part of their argument is a problem, and here's why. And so you're kind of giving in a little bit. You're not completely dismissing it or saying they're completely wrong, but you're saying, look, they have this good point about this, but they're mostly wrong. Or they have a good point about this, but there's a few issues that I have with it, okay? And so these are just some strategies to use, some ways of thinking about engaging with sources that hopefully will help. Okay. We talked about counterarguments a little bit with logical fallacies, so this is really just a review slide. Okay, so thinking about how to phrase the counterargument, you really want to make sure that you're including plenty of counterargument in this paper, right? It's a big part of the paper. And so when you're thinking about how to frame that, one thing that could be really helpful is thinking about um, posing this as a misunderstanding, okay? It's tempting a lot of times when we have a counter argument or when we have people we disagree with to kind of villainize them or oversimplify them, which sounds terrible, but is true. And so you want to try to avoid doing that because that's going to make you probably lose the argument. People don't like being disrespected or demeaned. And so a better way of talking about this typically is to say, a lot of people believe that aliens have visited the Earth. Like that's a very common belief. And so when you're starting with this kind of generalization, you're not pointing people out, you're not making people feel bad. That could be a good strategy. But the most important thing is to get to the point, which is, but a lot of people don't understand that there's not actual solid evidence that that's ever happened, right? So you're kind of getting into people think this, but they don't fully understand. Or a lot of people think that this means this, but that's actually not what happened, or whatever. You're kind of what you're doing is you're kind of posing this as a helpful correction, like, oh, a lot of people really think that, but you would be surprised to find out. And so you can see how that tone is a lot different than saying, God, some people are so stupid, they think blah, 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 blah. That's not helpful at all, right? And that won't work for discourse very well. I mean, it's just going to further sow divides. And so it's just something to think about how you can change your tone a little bit and how that can make your counter argument more effective. Okay. Devil's advocate, you might have heard of this before. And so I have some suggestions for how you can potentially think of this issue in a way that could help you be a devil's advocate. So if we're thinking of different types of arguments, like for example, a proposal argument, we should blank. A good devil's advocate strategy is to say, well, that's impractical because if we have a definition argument, which by the way, that's the most common type of argument that we have in politics and law. And so, for example, if we can't agree about what the Second Amendment means, which is true, we disagree about that as a society. That's why it's such a huge contentious issue. Then the devil's advocate position is that, the other side has an incorrect use of terms or understanding of the text. So you kind of see what I'm saying. It's a way of pointing out the problem with the argument to kind of help you think through, okay, well, what would they say? If you have a cause and effect argument, another very common type of controversial argument, the claim is that there's a wrong description or usage of process. So for example, when people say that climate change isn't caused by people, but that it's just a natural process or that it's even not happening, well, then you could say, well, you don't know, you're not thinking of climate change accurately. Otherwise, you'd be able to see, the effects of it or something like that. You're pointing out something that's wrong in their understanding. Unwarranted assumption is a good way of pointing out something with the bad foundations fallacy that we talked about last time, or with other kinds of, there's a flimsy belief at the very heart or root of the issue, and then what we're seeing are the branches coming off that tree, but we have to look at the root to see where the real problem is. So that's where you would point out, okay, well, there's a problem at the root, and so you would try to identify what that problem is. And then ignoring evidence and misrepresentation fallacy, like stacking the deck, or straw man fallacy, where you say, well, actually, that's not what they're saying, or, well, you're leaving out really important evidence. And so these are ways that you can point out those types of issues with an argument. That can be helpful. This is a review slide. Again, we talked about fallacies last time, but just kind of keep in mind, this is a really helpful way of talking about the problematic logic of conspiracy theories. Very common. And then finally, I'll just end with, I included a link to Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. And basically, I think that this is a perfect example of a rebuttal argument. And so if you're thinking about arguing against something, like a conspiracy theory, then I think that this would be a really helpful letter to look at. Martin Luther King was responding to white religious leaders who said that the civil rights activists were kind of taking things too far and they needed to just be patient and wait for change instead of, doing all these demonstrations and making people feel upset. And Martin Luther King was like, yeah, cool opinion. No, you're totally wrong. And he's very respectful, as much as you can be of somebody who has that kind of a take. But then he really clearly outlines why that argument is wrong. And he's using evidence that pastors, and other religious leaders would appreciate, right? He's using a lot of biblical references, a lot of philosophy, because he knows that that's the kind of evidence that they also use. And so that's another thing that you could potentially think about when you're thinking about how to make the most effective argument. All right, and I have some more slides about that. If you look at my last slides, they're kind of going over the same ideas, going over the ideas of the letter, just kind of breaking it down. It is pretty long. So that might be helpful to those of you who haven't read it before, but I really recommend it. I think it's great. Not a hot take. It's pretty celebrated. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. I hope this was helpful in thinking through how you're gonna argue for your conspiracy theory paper, and I'm looking forward to reading them pretty soon.